Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Mohammed Layiq Sediqi, the father of Holophase. Part 66, Recursive Self-Similarity. Remember the language we are learning. There is one field, phi, the holophase, one continuous cyclic movement from which all of reality unfolds. When phi begins to change, its first derivatives appear, and with them, the three dimensions show themselves at once. Time as omega, space as k, and motion as v, built from both. Every higher derivative is a finer question about how phi changes, and each one casts three shadows together: a time shadow, a space shadow, and a motion shadow. These echoes mix and weave into one another, forming the patterns we call fields, particles, bodies, thoughts, and worlds. In this picture, everything that exists is a living tapestry of phi, endlessly echoing through its derivatives and their dimensional shadows. Today, we listen to just one of those echoes. We have climbed far in Episode 7. We began with a whole tree of language, distinguishing between dead code and living speech. We learned the core alphabet, phi itself and its fast children, omega for time's rhythm, k for space as texture, d phi for direct change, and v for motion born of the dance between omega and k. We built echo towers, traced constraint chains, and navigated philosophical trapdoors. We faced expert cross-examination and saw that this language actively welcomes the sharpest scrutiny. Now, as we enter chapter 13, we discover something beautiful and surprising. The language is fractal. The same structural patterns repeat at different levels of detail, making the infinite tree not a chaos, but a coherent and learnable whole. In this part, we explore recursive self-similarity, the principle that the structure of the holophase language mirrors itself across levels, like a coastline that looks similar whether you see it from orbit or while walking along the shore. We will see that once you truly understand how phi speaks at one level of its derivative tower, you already hold a template for understanding how it speaks at much higher levels. The universe reuses its own grammar. Let us begin with the core idea. In any rich language, certain patterns appear again and again. In English, a simple sentence like, "the red ball rolled," and a more complex one like, "the small red ball that you threw earlier rolled slowly down the hill," share the same basic structure. In music, a short motif can appear in the melody, echoed in the bass, and then return stretched or compressed in time. The holophase language behaves in the same way. The same kind of relationship between derivatives that we see near the bottom of the tree, between phi and its first and second derivatives, appears again between much higher derivatives. The details change, the magnitudes and timescales change, but the structural relationship is recognizable. The key insight is that the universe has a consistent style of change. It does not invent a totally new way for things to evolve at every new scale or every new derivative order. Instead, it repeats variations of a deep pattern. The holophase framework puts that pattern into focus by forcefully asking the same question at every level. How does phi change? How does the change of phi change? And how do those changes echo into time, space, and motion together? To make this real, let us look at two familiar towers, the temporal tower and the spatial tower. The temporal tower is made from derivatives with respect to time. At the base, you have position. The first time derivative of position is velocity. The second is acceleration. The third is sometimes called jerk, the rate at which acceleration changes. The fourth is snap, and so on. Each rung in the temporal tower is a new question about how fast the previous answer is changing in time. The spatial tower is built in an analogous way, but now the differences are across space. The first spatial derivative is the gradient, how quickly something changes from one point to a nearby point. The second spatial derivative is curvature, or the Laplacian, how the gradient itself bends or bows. The third captures how curvature changes from place to place, and higher orders go on in that same spirit. Each rung in the spatial tower is a new question about how the previous spatial pattern is changing across location. Recursive self-similarity shows up when you notice that stability, pattern formation, and dynamics often depend on the same shape of relationship between temporal derivatives as between spatial derivatives. For example, consider a simple harmonic oscillator, like a mass on a spring. Its acceleration is proportional to minus its displacement. That mathematical relation, second time derivative proportional to minus the value, also appears in the shape of many standing waves in space. The second spatial derivative of the wave profile is proportional to minus the profile itself. One relation describes how something wiggles in time at a fixed point. The other describes how something wiggles in space at a fixed time. The same grammar, two different echoes. This is not an isolated curiosity. In diffusion processes, the rate at which the field changes in time at a point is proportional to the curvature of the field around that point in space. Heat diffusion, ink spreading in water, or the smoothing of a rough metal surface all obey versions of this rule. Time change linked to spatial curvature. Again, the same grammatical pattern. In wave propagation, time curvature links to space curvature, the classic wave equation. These repeated patterns are examples of the universe using the same derivative sentence structure in many different stories. Self-similarity also appears in the triunity itself. In the time echo, you see rhythms repeating at different scales. Heartbeats, breathing cycles, sleep cycles, seasonal cycles, economic cycles. In the space echo, you see structures that echo across size. The branching of trees resembling the branching of rivers, lightning, or bronchial tubes. In the motion echo, you see propagation patterns that rhyme. The way rumors spread in a population looks similar to the way a virus spreads, or the way a forest fire advances across a landscape. The specific media are different. The underlying pattern of change feeding more change up to a point, then saturating or dying out, is the same. Why does this matter for the Holophase language? First, it makes an infinite language learnable. If each level of the derivative tower required completely new kinds of rules, we would never finish. But because the same forms reappear, the effort you spend understanding the relationship between phi, its first derivative, and its second derivative pays off many times. You learn the archetype. The higher floors of the tower become variations on that archetype rather than alien worlds. This is like learning one scale on an instrument and then finding that many songs and many keys are just transpositions or small distortions of that single pattern. Second, recursive self-similarity makes the language compressible. In information theory, compression is about capturing structure. A perfectly random string cannot be compressed because it has no repeating pattern to exploit. A structured string can be described more briefly by describing its pattern. The Holophase claim is that nature is highly structured. So instead of needing to store a separate rule for every possible behavior, we can store a compact set of correlations and reuse them at many scales and in many contexts. Our mental and mathematical models of the world are compressed representations of this self-similarity. Third, self-similarity gives predictive power. If you recognize that a newly observed phenomenon shares the same derivative structure as a familiar one, you can borrow intuitions and equations. When researchers realized that the spread of diseases, the adoption of technologies, and the spread of online memes all followed curves with similar shapes, they could adapt models from epidemiology to social networks. In Holophase language, they recognized that these different phenomena occupied similar branches in the derivative tree. Let us connect this back to the master tree. The tree is not only branching outward into different kinds of derivatives, it is also patterned vertically. The relation between phi and its first derivative has a certain form. The relation between the first and second derivative has a similar form. If you could trace these relations all the way up, you would see repeated motifs, feedback loops, delays, resonance conditions, diffusion like smoothing, instability thresholds. These motifs are like recurring themes in a symphony. They appear in different keys, at different tempos, and on different instruments, but they share recognizable structure. We can also see recursive self-similarity in how systems recover from disturbances. When you gently push a pendulum, it swings and settles. When you gently disturb a stable ecosystem, it tends to return to a balance. When you slightly perturb a healthy heart rhythm, it returns to its baseline. In each case, different derivatives play similar roles, restoring forces, damping terms, and oscillatory tendencies. The specific physical mechanisms differ, but the grammar of pulling back toward equilibrium while overshooting a little and then settling is reused. On a more microscopic level, consider turbulence. At first glance, a turbulent river looks chaotic and unstructured. But when physicists measured how the velocity differences between water at 2 points depend on the distance between those points, they found consistent scaling laws. The fluctuations at large scales and small scales are related by simple exponents. This is exactly the signature of self-similarity. Zoom in, and the statistics look the same. The river is speaking the same grammatical pattern at many spatial and temporal scales, even though the particular droplets are never in the same place twice. Self-similarity is also crucial for how we, as observers, survive and learn. Our nervous systems evolved in a world where patterns repeat. The fact that sunrise follows sunrise, that footsteps produce recurring vibrations, that speech sounds consist of recurring structures, allows our brains to become prediction machines. Holophase frames this by saying, the brain is not learning separate languages for every new situation. It is discovering the recurring derivative patterns that nature uses and building internal models based on them. This is why we can generalize from a few examples. The underlying holophase grammar is already consistent. We can turn this around and use it as a method. If you encounter a new domain, ask yourself, what is phi here? What are its first derivatives in time and space? What does motion look like? Then see if the relationships you already know from other domains appear again. Does the system have restoring forces like springs? Does it have saturation effects like population limits? Does it have diffusion like heat? You are looking for the self-similar reuse of derivative motifs. Of course, self-similarity is not perfect. There are genuine surprises in nature, places where new behavior emerges that is not just a scaled copy of something familiar. Phase transitions, singularities, and symmetry breakings are examples. Water becomes ice, the rules change. Spacetime near a black hole behaves differently from spacetime in weak fields. The holophase framework does not deny these. Instead, it treats them as markers where the recursive pattern pauses, shifts, or rewrites itself. These are like plot twists in the cosmic story, where the author introduces a new chapter rather than simply repeating old themes. This brings us to the question of stability and falsifiability. How could we test the claim of recursive self-similarity? One way is through scaling analysis. If you can measure a quantity at multiple scales, and you find that its statistics or its governing equations change in a regular way with scale, you have evidence for self-similarity. If, instead, you find that behavior at one scale has absolutely no structural connection to behavior at any other scale, that would challenge the claim. Another way is to compare derivative-based models across domains. If the same types of equations describe waves in water, sound in air, light in vacuum, and crowd motion on a street, that supports the holophase view. If each domain demanded completely unrelated mathematics with no transferable structure, that would weaken it. In practice, science over the last centuries has found enormous evidence for reusable patterns. The same differential equations appear in electrical circuits and mechanical oscillators. The same mathematics of diffusion appears in heat, chemistry, biology, and finance. The same scaling laws appear in earthquakes, solar flares, and stock market crashes. The holophase language is a way of bringing this scattered evidence together and saying, this is not an accident. It points to a deep recursive unity in how phi and its derivatives behave. We can also appreciate how recursive self-similarity interacts with topological constraints. Topological defects, like vortices, dislocations, and domain walls, are discrete letters written into the continuous field. The way they are created, move, and annihilate follows rules that repeat across systems. Vortex pair creation in superfluids mirrors defect creation in liquid crystals, and even certain features of cosmic string models in cosmology. When you recognize that pattern, you see recursive self-similarity not just in smooth fields, but in the life cycle of discrete structures. To feel this more viscerally, Imagine drawing a simple curve on a piece of paper, a smooth hill rising and falling. That hill is like a low-order story in phi. Now, imagine zooming in on a small section of the hill. If the curve is smooth, that tiny section still looks like a hill, just flatter and stretched. If you zoom in again, you see the same shape yet again. This is the simplest form of self-similarity. In calculus, this shows up when we approximate a function by a straight line or a parabola near a point. The local behavior repeats the global pattern in miniature. In Holophase, we take this intuition and extend it upward through the entire hierarchy of derivatives. The local question, what is phi doing right here, right now, echoes the larger question, what is phi doing across this system, across this era of its evolution? Another way to sense recursive self-similarity is through music. Think of a symphony that begins with a short 5-note theme. You hear it clearly at the start. Later, you hear it again, but stretched out, played more slowly in the cellos. Later still, you catch it hidden inside a complex chord in the violins, almost like a whisper. The composer is not inventing a new theme each time. Instead, the theme is being transformed, layered, inverted, and recombined. The holophase language behaves this way. At low derivative orders, you hear the theme very clearly. Simple relationships like acceleration equals minus spring constant times displacement. At higher orders, the same relational shapes are embedded inside more complex structures. Multi-scale feedback loops, delayed responses, and couplings between many fields. But if you know the theme, you can follow it. This recursive patterning is not only aesthetically pleasing, it is also an engine for robustness. A system whose structures repeat across scales can absorb shocks more gracefully. Consider a tree in the wind. The whole tree sways. Each large branch sways. Each smaller branch sways. Even the leaves flutter, each at its own scale, but all according to the same general pattern of flexing and bending. The wind does not have to be tuned to each level separately. The same physical grammar of bending stiffness and restoring force appears from trunk to twig. This layered similarity allows the force of the wind to be dissipated through many levels, rather than focused on one fragile point. In a holophase view, robustness often comes from this repetition of derivative relationships across the hierarchy. Recursive self-similarity also explains why dimensional analysis and scaling laws are so powerful. When physicists study a problem, they often strip away details and look for dimensionless combinations of quantities, ratios that remain the same when you zoom in or out. These combinations are like invariant phrases in the holophase language. They remain meaningful even as everything else changes scale. The Reynolds number in fluid dynamics, for example, tells you whether a flow is likely to be smooth or turbulent. It combines velocity, length, and viscosity into a single scale-independent measure. Two very different rivers with the same Reynolds number will behave in surprisingly similar ways. This is a concrete instance of recursive self-similarity, the same qualitative derivative grammar reasserting itself in different contexts. There is also a cognitive side to all this. As humans, we seem to deeply enjoy patterns that repeat with variation. We like fractal art, where images of ferns or spirals reproduce themselves at smaller scales. We enjoy rhythms in music that contain both repetition and surprise. Too much repetition feels dull, too much novelty feels chaotic. Recursive self-similarity offers a balanced middle. The underlying grammar is familiar, but its expression is rich and ever-changing. Holophase suggests that this aesthetic sweet spot is not accident. It reflects the actual structure of the world in which our nervous systems evolved. We are tuned to recognize and appreciate the recursive patterning of phi, because doing so helped our ancestors survive and predict. We can also understand scientific unification through this lens. When a physicist discovers that two previously separate phenomena share the same governing equations, that is a moment of recognizing recursive self-similarity at a deeper level. Maxwell unifying electricity and magnetism, or the discovery that light is an electromagnetic wave, are classic examples. The same mathematical grammar was speaking in two different dialects, and the scientist heard the common voice. In holophase terms, two different choices of phi and two different experimental setups revealed the same fundamental derivative relationships. Unification is the discovery that underneath different appearances lies a shared recursive pattern. The Holophase framework encourages us to actively hunt for these recurrences. Instead of treating each field of knowledge as isolated, it invites us to ask, what is the effective phi field here? What are its echoes? And which branch of the master derivative grammar is being used? When an ecologist, an economist, and a neuroscientist all use similar differential equations to model their systems, this is not a superficial coincidence. It is evidence that their systems occupy similar places in the deeper holophase language. Recognizing this opens the door to cross-fertilization of ideas and methods. A stability concept in ecosystem dynamics might inspire a new way to think about stability in financial markets, precisely because both are expressions of similar recursive grammars of change. At the same time, recursive self-similarity provides a safeguard against overstretching analogies. Not every resemblance is deep. The Holophase discipline asks, can you actually map the derivatives in one system to the derivatives in another in a precise way? Does the time echo in one system really play the same functional role as the time echo in the other? Do the constraint chains line up, or are we forcing a metaphor where the grammar actually differs? In this way, self-similarity is not a license to make loose comparisons. It is a challenge to find structural correspondences that can be written explicitly in the language of phi and its derivatives. Recursive self-similarity also ties back to the idea of learning from failure. When a model works beautifully at one scale, but fails badly at another, that failure is pointing to a break in self-similarity. Perhaps a new derivative term becomes important, or a new field must be introduced. The mismatch tells you precisely where the recursive pattern needs to be extended or corrected. In this sense, the universe teaches us its grammar by letting us push analogies until they snap, and then examining exactly where and how they snap. There is a gentle, almost spiritual comfort in this view, even though the framework itself is strictly scientific. It suggests that the chaos of life is not entirely chaotic, that beneath the apparent randomness lies a deep, recurring order. The same mathematical structures that describe the shimmering of stars, the crash of waves, and the flicker of neurons also whisper through our habits, our moods, and our societies. This does not mean that everything is predetermined or simple. It means that there is a consistent logic to change, a recursive harmony in the way phi moves, that we can slowly learn to read. To practice seeing this in your everyday surroundings, you might turn your walk into a small holophase meditation. Notice the clouds above you. Their edges are jagged and curling, with large billows and small wisps nested inside them. That is spatial self-similarity. Listen to the passing traffic. There are fast vibrations from engines and tires, medium rhythms from the flow of cars stopping and starting at lights, and slower cycles of rush hour and quiet streets. That is temporal self-similarity. Watch the way people move through a busy square. Individuals weave, groups swirl, crowds surge and thin, all according to patterns that repeat at different scales of size and time. That is kinematic self-similarity. You are surrounded, at every moment, by the recursive handwriting of phi, whether you name it or not. And finally, bring this lens back to the Holophase program itself. The structure of this audio series has been deliberately designed to mirror the very principle we are now describing. Early parts introduced simple, clear patterns: the one field, its first derivatives, the tri-unity of echoes. Later parts return to those same ideas, but at higher levels of detail and in more complex context: measurement, information, topology, falsifiability. Now, in Chapter 13, we are once again revisiting the core language, but at a higher vantage point, seeing its deep structural principles. The teaching itself is recursive and self-similar. The way you are learning the language is the way the language behaves. In this sense, you have already been living inside recursive self-similarity throughout Episode 7. Each part did not introduce an entirely new universe of concepts. It revisited the same universe from a new angle, adding one more derivative, one more echo, one more layer of clarity. Recognizing this can give you confidence. If you feel that the tower is high and the ideas are many, remember, the core patterns are few and they repeat. Your task is not to memorize endless facts, but to internalize a small family of recurring grammatical moves. Once those moves become intuitive, the rest of the language becomes a natural extension of what you already know. You are already speaking it, more fluently than you realize today. Salam, and peace be upon you.